You may or may not have heard of an interesting little game called American McGee's Alice, released in 2000 for PC and Mac, then re-released digitally alongside its sequel, Alice Madness Returns, in 2011 for modern consoles. American McGee's Alice is an action game with platforming and puzzle-solving elements where you play as Alice Little, the titular character from Lewis Carroll's classic novels Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Unlike the bright and playful originals, however, American McGee's Alice is a dark, macabre sequel to these stories, in which a 7-year-old Alice Little becomes the sole survivor of a devastating house fire that destroys her home and kills her entire family. Alice suffers severe PTSD and survivor's guilt following the incident and is committed to Rutledge Asylum after falling into a catatonic state. She lives in the asylum for 10 years with little progress, when suddenly she reawakens after being reunited with her beloved stuffed rabbit toy shortly after her 18th birthday. Alice mentally retreats back to Wonderland to avoid dealing with the horrors of her new life, but finds it twisted and broken, apparently due to the tyrannical rule of the Red Queen, who in Alice's absence has been allowed to run amok and take over all of Wonderland.
Stir up no trouble, stranger. The Red Queen's agents are ruthless.
Of course, we as the players know that Wonderland has become a twisted, broken, and deadly version of itself because it is a reflection of Alice's own psyche, which has been horribly damaged by her traumatic experiences. And throughout the course of the game, Alice herself comes to understand this as well. The sequel heavily expands upon these themes and reveals a much deeper and more detailed background to the catalyzing event of the story, as Alice, now recovered from her catatonia, tries to uncover the truth of how her family perished. I was glad to find such an emphasis on the story in Madness Returns, because while the original sets up the very compelling story that is the backbone of the game, it doesn't spend a lot of time really dissecting it. The entirety of the first game takes place inside Wonderland, while the sequel has a number of short sections in which the player takes control of Alice in the real world. This is a microcosm of what each game is like in a nutshell. American McGee's Alice seems like it set up the story simply as an excuse to create a twisted version of Wonderland for players to explore, and as a result the gameplay is fun, but the story, while brilliant in concept, is bare bones, little more than the concept itself. Madness Returns, on the other hand, places a huge emphasis on the story and how that story is expressed through the beautiful visuals of the game's world. The gameplay, unfortunately, didn't feel like it got as much attention. Let's dive into each game in a little more detail. This was my experience playing the Alice games for the very first time in the year 2021. Now, let me just say right off the bat that it took me about an hour to actually get the game working. I bought Alice Madness Returns on Steam a long time ago when it was on sale for like $5, and after looking into it a little bit, I discovered that there was a previous game that came before it. But given that it wasn't available on Steam, and that it was an old game that came out over 20 years ago, I didn't pay it much mind and figured I probably wouldn't end up playing it. I discovered, however, that the Steam version of Alice Madness Returns is the complete edition of the game, which includes DLC and a remastered version of American McGee's Alice. Well, sort of. The version of Alice Madness Returns that was on Steam, yes, was because it's no longer available there, does technically have all of the extra content that was freely available on the complete edition released for consoles. But for some reason, it's not available when you first start the game. The files are all there, but they're locked somehow. So you need to go into the game's configuration files and edit a line to actually make the extra content available. I learned about this as I was looking into the game, so obviously I did it, and this added an option to the main menu of Madness Returns to launch the remastered version of the original game. Except it didn't work, because the remaster didn't actually come packaged with the Steam version of Madness Returns. But at this point, I was too curious to pass it up, and I very strongly prefer playing games in chronological order anyway, so I acquired the game and installed it. From there, I had to do a fair bit of tinkering with the location of the game's folder and shortcuts and all kinds of other stuff, but once I finally did get it working, I found it was actually worth it. The first thing that immediately struck me were the game's visuals. American McGee's Alice runs on the Quake engine, and I've always loved the look of games that use it. Even though the graphics do look dated, the environments and characters are full of personality, and the level design is interesting. The game immediately makes you understand that this is a very weird and messed up world, and I found it surprisingly immersive. I also picked the hardest difficulty when I started the game, which is called Nightmare difficulty. I didn't have any particular expectations, but holy cow, it was hard, at least at the beginning. The combat did get somewhat easier as I progressed through the game and got a feel for the mechanics, and also as I acquired more weapons, which give you more options in combat, but it took me like 5 whole minutes across 7 or 8 different attempts to defeat the very first enemy in the game. I wasn't really sure how to approach combat at first, because it feels like Alice attacks very slow, but the enemies attack very fast. I tried a few different hit and run strategies, but a lot of the enemies have fairly large ranges that they can strike you from. Their attacks always seem to come out fast, and you have no dodge maneuver or any kind of burst movement option to avoid incoming attacks. They also just do tons of damage on Nightmare difficulty, so I died a lot. But honestly, I did actually have fun the whole time. Even though the movement and the combat is sort of clunky, I enjoyed figuring out how to make the mechanics work for me. This game also has a quick save and quick load feature, and I have a real soft spot for old PC games that are difficult enough to make you want to quick save every time you're about to walk into a new area. This also made it so that even though I died a whole bunch in the beginning, I never really got too frustrated because I was able to quick load right to the beginning of the encounter and just jump into a new attempt whenever I failed. I also felt like the game was pretty well paced. You acquire new weapons just frequently enough that once you feel like you've got a grasp on how to handle the game's various enemies with the tools you've got so far, the game gives you a new tool. There are 9 different weapons in the game, and most of them have 2 different types of attacks that you can do with them, so you've actually got a fair amount of freedom with how to approach combat, which is good because the enemy encounters also happen in varied environments. As you saw earlier, the very first enemy encounter in the game is in an extremely cramped hallway where you have very little room to maneuver, but other encounters happen in wide open arenas. Others still occur in rooms with obstacles and debris that you can use to avoid attacks, and I felt like I was frequently trying to use the environment to my advantage during combat, which is something I always like in games. Alice has a health bar and a magic bar, or as the game calls it, willpower, and managing those resources is crucial, at least on Nightmare difficulty. This game does the distinctly old game thing where you can only regenerate resources through pickups, which drop from enemies and are sometimes found in the environment as well. I love this personally, because actually having to worry about how much health you have is way more compelling to me than games that just let you regenerate health after avoiding damage for a few seconds. Willpower is used to power some of the game's weapons, and it's nicely balanced. Certain weapons only use willpower when you perform their alternate attacks, and some are entirely reliant upon it. The first weapon you acquire in the game is the Vorpal Blade, which is a short-range melee weapon with an alternate attack that lets you throw it as a projectile. None of these attacks use willpower. After that, you acquire the Playing Cards, which are thrown projectile weapons that are totally reliant on willpower to use. It's a nice little contrast right at the beginning of the game. While you can use the Vorpal Blade as a ranged weapon, it's very slow because you have to wait about 3 seconds for it to return to your hand after throwing it. You also need to actually aim it to hit your enemies. The cards, on the other hand, auto-home in on the nearest enemy and fire very fast, but they require magic, so you can't just spam them endlessly. This trend of opening up combat and balancing how you fight enemies continues throughout the game. The third weapon you get is the Croquet Mallet, which is a melee weapon that has an alternate projectile attack which uses willpower.
Here's a riddle. When is a croquet mallet like a billy club? I'll tell you, whenever you want it to be.
I found the Vorpal Blade difficult to actually use as a melee weapon, due to its short range and slow attack speed, but the Croquet Mallet dealt with enemies at close range much more effectively because of its longer reach and faster attacks. Using this weapon, I was able to develop a consistent rhythm for running up to enemies, hitting them, and then quickly backing out of range so they couldn't hit me back. It wasn't exactly rocket science, but it was fun, and because you take so much damage from every hit on Nightmare difficulty, there was always a sense of tension because I knew I would die quickly if I screwed up. Combat continues to get more interesting as you acquire more weapons. One of my favorite weapons in the game is the Ice Wand. Its primary attack is basically just a stream of magic that constantly deals damage, but its alternate attack creates a small wall of ice directly in front of Alice that blocks enemy attacks and forces them to move around it to get to you. In the second half of the game, I started to find some really fun uses for this. I frequently started using this ability in conjunction with another weapon, the Jack Bomb. This weapon is basically a grenade that detonates after a few seconds, but its alternate attack has it spray fire all over the place, damaging enemies in a wide area for about 10 seconds before exploding. Using the Ice Wand and the Jack Bomb in conjunction, I would create walls to box enemies in, then toss a fire-spewing Jack Bomb over the walls and watch the enemies helplessly take damage. In classic old game fashion, the game never gives you any tips about how to use the weapons or items it provides you. This was just a strategy I started naturally doing on my own, and it was fun to figure out. The difficulty is balanced well throughout the whole game also. In the second half of the game, enemies start to have significantly more health, but it comes just in time for the game to give you more powerful weapons to deal with them. The game also starts throwing enemies at you in much greater numbers, making every encounter increasingly more dangerous. But in addition to the more powerful weapons you have, these more powerful enemies also start dropping bigger health and willpower pickups, usually allowing you to get most or all of your health and willpower back after defeating a big group of enemies. In this way, the game rewards you for fighting off bigger challenges. The last few weapons you acquire are also pretty fun to use and do a lot to help you feel more powerful. The Jabberwock's Eye Staff fires off a powerful laser beam and then an explosive projectile at the end of the attack, and it became my primary weapon near the end of the game because it was the only thing that took out enemies fast enough due to their increased health pools. And although it uses a lot of willpower, I was able to mostly recover after each encounter due to the increased health drops I mentioned. There's also the Blunderbuss, which is basically a cannon that fires off a single projectile that creates a massive explosion on impact. You need to have full willpower to use it, and it completely depletes the bar, but it also one-shots basically any enemy that it hits. Even though there aren't any kind of mechanics that let you increase Alice's innate abilities as the game goes on, the pace at which you acquire new and more powerful weapons gives a potent sense of progression throughout the game. All of this culminates in a suitably epic final boss battle against the Red Queen that is also challenging, albeit in sort of a cheap way. The first phase of the fight takes place in a throne room, with the Queen firing off all kinds of magical attacks at you while you try to avoid them and strike back from a distance. The second phase of the fight happens in a vast cavern against the Queen's monstrous true form. These fights were challenging, but only really because the Queen has so much health that the only way you can do any real damage to her is by using your most powerful weapons, which use up lots of willpower. Because of the layout of the arenas, the bosses can't be attacked with melee weapons, which basically means that once you run out of willpower, you can't really do any damage to them. So the fight devolves into this cycle of do damage, run away and avoid attacks while you wait for health pickups to spawn in the arena, which will allow you to recover willpower, and then attack again. It's a little boring from a gameplay perspective, but at least the spectacle of the fights is impressive for an old game. Overall, it was a satisfying end to the journey of the first game. Now, let's move on to the sequel. Alice Madness Returns takes place 1 year after the events of the first game, and finds Alice living in the Houndsditch Home for Wayward Youth under the care of psychiatrist Dr. Angus Bumby, who is attempting to help Alice forget her traumatic memories through hypnosis so she can move on with her life.
I want to forget. Who would choose to be alone, imprisoned by their broken memories?
I'll set you free, Alice. Memory is a curse more often than a blessing.
So you've said, many times.
Madness Returns is similar to the first game in a lot of general ways, such as its genre. Like its predecessor, Madness Returns has gameplay that focuses on a mix of platforming, puzzle solving, and combat, and is set primarily in the vibrant yet frightening world of Wonderland, which is now being corrupted by a new evil called Ruin, which manifests as thick black sludge. Speaking of being vibrant, the graphics of Madness Returns are the biggest upgrade compared to its predecessor. There were 11 years between the release of the original and the sequel, and it shows. Madness Returns is absolutely gorgeous. In some ways, it looks like a modern-gen game even now. In addition to the beautiful graphics and breathtaking environmental design, parts of the story are told through wonderfully creative 2D cinematics that have the vibe of a children's storybook, aside from their contents, of course. There are also collectible memories scattered and sometimes hidden throughout the levels. When you pick them up, they play an audio soundbite from Alice's past.
You're that frog, Alice, I swear. You jump so well.
I really liked this touch because it fills out the story and makes Alice a much deeper, more complete character than she was in the first game. Unfortunately, the visuals overshadow almost every other element of the game aside from the story and characters, which remain very compelling. In a lot of ways, the gameplay of Madness Returns is a serious downgrade from the original, which features more than double the number of usable weapons available in the sequel. This decision alone significantly reduces the amount of variety you can get from the combat, especially given that all of the game's enemies are simple and heavily telegraphed, never really mixing up any of their combat patterns. Don't get me wrong, the combat in this game actually feels okay most of the time. It's just very easy, and not very interesting. Mid-combat movement is fast-paced and smooth, and there is a dodge mechanic that makes Alice temporarily invincible and allows her to quickly cover a short distance. One of the cool elements of the game's combat mechanics is that any of Alice's attack animations can immediately be cancelled by using her dodge move. You can dodge mid-attack at any point with any weapon, allowing you to zip around the battlefield and switch targets freely. Now, this all sounds cool, but as I previously mentioned, there are only 4 usable weapons in Madness Returns, and all of them are completely one-dimensional, with basically no options for making their usage any more varied, unlike the previous game in which almost every weapon had an alternate attack. Weapons can be upgraded through the use of teeth, which are currency that drop from enemies and breakable items. Alice also starts with a small pool of health at the beginning of the game, which grows as you progress further in the story. I did enjoy this feeling of progression, but upgrading your weapons doesn't make them any more interesting, it just makes them more powerful, and combat is already pretty easy to begin with due to the enemies being very simple. Most of them only have 1 or 2 different attacks that are all pretty easy to dodge, which is made even easier by the fact that the game frequently slows down time right before an enemy is about to hit you, just to give you the opportunity to dodge. Like the first game, I picked Nightmare difficulty in my first playthrough, and was shocked to find how easy it was in comparison to the original. Enemies still hit like trucks. Some enemies can even one-shot you at the beginning of the game before you start to get more health. But it's pretty easy to simply avoid getting hit in the first place. And once you have enough health that you can survive a few hits, combat starts to feel pretty trivial. The difficulty balance is also weird. The beginning of the game is much harder due to the fact that you don't have much health yet, and you can be killed in only a few attacks, just like the first game. As the game goes on, Alice gets more health and her weapons get more powerful, but the enemies don't match that pace. In the first game, enemies got significantly stronger, and there were also more of them in each encounter as the game went on. But in Madness Returns, although each chapter introduces new enemies that are thematic to the environment, none of them ever really feel like they're getting more difficult. And they're always backed up by the basic ruin enemies that you've been fighting since the beginning of the game, so eventually it starts to feel pretty stale. There's also a very strange combat design decision in that most enemies in the game appear to gain super armor at some point during each of their attacks. If you try to attack an opponent while they're mid-swing, most of the time they will tank straight through your attack and just hit you, even if you're using the Hobby Horse, which is the game's slow, heavy melee weapon, and the one touted as being able to smash through even the toughest defenses. This sort of thing is indicative of a lot of the actual gameplay mechanics in Madness Returns. It feels like 95% of the developers' collective brainpower went into the game's aesthetics, and the actual gameplay just got the leftovers. The combat in the first game may be sort of clunky, but it was at least actually fun. Every encounter in the first game made me think, how do I approach this? While every encounter in the sequel is basically the same. You run in and hit the attack button over and over until everything is dead, and as long as you're paying attention to the time-dilated cues that the game hands you, you can dodge most attacks and not really have to think about what you're doing. This trend of overly simple gameplay extends to the platforming as well. Madness Returns doesn't feature any particularly interesting movement mechanics, and it also doesn't exactly present you with challenges to your technical ability or reaction time like classic platformers such as Crash Bandicoot. I will say that there's more variety in the platforming in Madness Returns than there is in the first game. Madness Returns introduces the ability to shrink, which also gives Alice Shrink Sense, an ability that allows her to see invisible platforms. There are also more puzzle-solving elements in this game, but in my experience, all of the puzzles were pretty trivial to figure out, and the game always pointed you in the right direction. And the levels, while beautiful to look at, are very linear and don't give you very much room to explore beyond the obvious path that you're supposed to follow. There are secret areas you can find if you do explore, which is good, but there's only ever one way to reach the end of each level. To be fair, most of the stuff I just said is also true about the first game. The platforming is pretty simple and most of the levels are linear with not a ton of room to explore. But because American McGee's Alice is an old game, it doesn't do that thing the sequel does where every time you walk into a new room, you're treated to a cutscene that basically shows you exactly what you need to do next. I can't stand when games give me the answer before I've even figured out the question, and Madness Returns does that the entire way through. The first game may not be a masterclass in open-ended level design and player agency, but I at least felt like I was always figuring out where to go on my own. Madness Returns also suffers from a serious lack of boss fights. I know this is a pretty specific gripe, but games like these just need boss fights to feel complete. And Madness Returns lacking in this area is very noticeable, especially due to the fact that its predecessor featured a number of boss fights in places that you'd expect. The strangest part is that every single one of the game's chapters was perfectly set up for a boss fight at the end. In fact, the first chapter ends with a textbook cutscene that looks like it's about to end in a boss battle, but then it just doesn't. Like, well, how about I just let you watch it for yourself?
We found the source of the shaking, but are those two quaking? What are they up to?
You'll never stop us, silly Hatter and Alice. It's left. You're too late.
The insolence, the arrogance, the execrable table manners. They are destroyers of Wonderland, defilers, denuders, derangers, delightful,
Did they actually create that infernal train to destroy Wonderland?
What does that matter? They deserve to die. Put me down this instant. I ought to...
Enough talk. Battle time, Missy. Abandon false hope. Forget the past. The damage is done.
Let the madness begin. Resume the folly.
Oh no.
I mean, what was that? Like, I get it. It's fun to subvert the audience's expectations, but this isn't a movie, it's a video game. Fighting bosses is the natural conclusion to each act of a game like this, and every single act of this game could have easily included a satisfying boss fight. Seriously, every single chapter feels like it's supposed to end in a boss fight, but none of them do until you get to the very end of the game. The end of Chapter 1 is the cutscene you just watched, where they literally pull a fake-out boss fight. Chapter 2 finds Alice running around completing tasks for Carpenter and his sidekick Walrus, only to be betrayed by them near the end. Carpenter and Walrus leave Alice stranded in a haunted cemetery, but she escapes and makes her way back to the theater where Carpenter is debuting his highly anticipated show. It feels like this is going to be some climactic confrontation, but instead, when Alice and Carpenter run into each other again, they both seem completely unbothered by each other's presence, despite the fact that they are basically now enemies. So the chapter just ends in kind of an anticlimactic way. Chapter 3 has Alice in an area called the Mysterious East, fighting off a colony of samurai wasps to save the innocent and helpless origami ants. Now, check this out. This room right here is the final area before the end of the chapter. This is a boss arena if I've ever seen one, and you can't convince me it's not. But instead of fighting a boss here, you just fight another group of the same enemies you've been fighting for the whole chapter. To make matters worse, if you go into the game's unlockable character profiles, there is a profile and even concept art for a character called Empress Wasp. This character literally does not ever appear in-game, nor is she ever even mentioned. Why is this Empress Wasp not the boss of Chapter 3? Rhetorical question, because I'm sure the answer is that budget and/or time constraints prevented the developers from adding her to the game. But at a certain point, showing us concept art of what could have and should have been feels like kind of a cruel tease. Finally, Chapter 4 has Alice in Queensland, the kingdom of the Queen of Hearts. Throughout this chapter, Alice is chased by the Executioner, a towering giant that is invincible and impossible to damage. When he's pursuing you, your only option is to run from him and escape. Near the end of the chapter, you are treated to this cutscene. Now, don't get me wrong, I love this cutscene. It's probably my favorite one in the game. But they also had a perfect opportunity here to turn this into a boss fight. The very next level after this cutscene allows you to control a giant Alice as she rampages through the kingdom's defenses and fights her way to the Queen's Citadel. They could have easily extended this level, and instead of having Alice simply become so large that she could effortlessly kill a previously undamageable enemy, had her become the same size as the Executioner, thus allowing for a boss fight against a very cool opponent now that they're on even footing. You see what I mean? Every single act of this game is practically begging for a boss fight to conclude that part of the story, but they simply chose not to have any until the very end of the game. I really don't understand it, and it's a pretty big detriment in my opinion. And, to make matters worse, the final boss is just underwhelming. Fighting the Red Queen at the end of the first game felt epic and climactic, and it was actually sort of challenging. But the final boss of Madness Returns, while impressive in spectacle, is just kind of boring to fight in terms of its mechanics. You spend the majority of the fight just avoiding his attacks and fighting fodder ruin enemies. Again, the same kind you've been fighting the entire game. It almost doesn't even feel like you're really fighting the boss itself. You're just fighting a bunch of his minions while avoiding his attacks. After the conclusion of the first game, I was really expecting more, and it was a pretty big letdown. Unfortunately, even the technical achievements of the graphics and art design are mired in annoyance due to the game's poor PC optimization. I can't speak for the console releases since I haven't played them, but the Steam version has a number of problems that seem like very easily fixable issues, such as being susceptible to random frame rate drops and sometimes even outright crashing or full game freezing. Some of the default key bindings don't work until you go into the configuration file and edit them, and as previously mentioned, the DLC content that was released for the console versions actually is packaged within the game, but it's inaccessible without a configuration file edit. The game is also natively capped at 31 FPS, but this too can be changed by editing the configuration file, and it absolutely should be. It practically looks like a brand new game running at 60 FPS, and I can't imagine why the developers wouldn't at least give you the option to choose the frame rate yourself. Since I've mentioned it a few times, I'll talk briefly about the DLC content. In each chapter of the game, Alice wears a new outfit based on the area of Wonderland that the chapter takes place in. There are 6 outfits in total, and when you beat the game and unlock New Game Plus, each outfit gains a unique ability. The DLC adds 6 more outfits, each with their own ability and alternate versions of each of the game's 4 weapons, which have bonus effects, such as increased damage or ammunition. All in all, it's pretty bare-bones DLC. If they were going to add new weapons, I would have hoped for, new weapons, not just stronger versions of the same ones you already have. And while some of the outfits are really, really cool and amazing to look at, like the new weapons, they don't fundamentally change anything about how you play the game. DLC like this isn't really adding any content, it's just making variations on what's already there. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but getting real enjoyment out of it requires the base game to have strong replay value, and I have to say Madness Returns just doesn't really have that in my opinion. Speaking of replay value, One of the things that normally contributes to that is collectibles. Madness Returns does have collectible items such as the memories I previously mentioned, but they don't really unlock anything super meaningful in my opinion. I like the memories a lot because they reveal more of the story in real time as you're playing through it, but the other unlockables are just things like concept art and character profiles, which are interesting for about 5 minutes. This isn't a specific knock on Madness Returns, I'm just not generally super interested in those kinds of unlockable rewards in games, because they only last as long as it takes to read through them once, and then I never go back to revisit them. Now, let me reel it back for a minute. I know I've been talking disproportionately about things I didn't like in this game, but I don't want to give people the wrong impression. I didn't dislike Madness Returns. I actually enjoyed it. It's just that I enjoyed the story a lot more than anything else, and I found the gameplay a little lacking in comparison to its predecessor. In all fairness, while the gameplay of the first game is superior in my opinion, the story is very lacking compared to the sequel. It's just that if I had to choose between a game with a bare-bones story but engaging gameplay, and a game with a really engaging story but sort of shallow gameplay, I prefer the former. I do want to end this on a positive note though, so let me talk about the end of Madness Returns, which is amazing. Heads up, I'm about to spoil the end of the game and reveal its biggest twist. This is also a trigger warning, because the story takes an even darker turn near the end and grapples with difficult subjects like sexual assault and pedophilia. You've been warned. Throughout the course of the story, Alice is trying to discover the cause of the fire that ruined her life. The official paperwork surrounding the incident states that the fire started when Alice's cat knocked over an oil lamp, but she doesn't believe it. As the story progresses, Alice unlocks more and more of her repressed memories from that day, and she eventually remembers that she saw someone who had broken into their home and suspects that they were the one who started the fire. The final act of the game reveals the last piece of the puzzle, which is that the perpetrator was none other than Dr. Angus Bumby, Alice's guardian at the orphanage. Bumby is not the good-intentioned doctor that he appears to be. He does indeed use psychiatric hypnosis to make children forget their pasts, but his true goal is to turn them into submissive, obedient slaves that can then be sold into child prostitution rings. Bumby is a pedophilic sexual predator that was lusting after Alice's older sister Elizabeth and started the fire at the little house to cover up his crime when he broke into their home and assaulted her one night. This is a truly horrifying revelation that makes the story a lot scarier and more disturbing. Bumby's counterpart in Wonderland is the Dollmaker, who is the final boss of the game.
You misbegotten abomination! Murderer! You blood-sucking parasite! The damage you've done to children! The abuse!
I provide a service. In the great and awful metropolis, appetites of all sorts must be gratified.
I already talked about how this fight was a letdown from a gameplay perspective, but from a narrative one, it's really satisfying. Alice's fight against the Dollmaker in Wonderland is mirrored by her real-world confrontation with Bumby after she's realized the truth about him, and by defeating the Dollmaker in Wonderland, Alice gains the strength and courage in the real world to take revenge on her abuser and avenge her family's death. I could describe what happens, but let's just watch the final cutscene.
I'll see you charged. In prison, some half-wit bruiser will make you his sweetheart, and then you'll hang.
Indeed. A hysterical woman, former lunatic, roaring outrageous accusations against a respectable social architect and scientist. My God, Alice, who would believe you? I scarcely believe it myself.
You, monstrous creature. Such evil will be punished.
By whom? By what? Psychotic, silly bitch. Your madness will be punished. Now leave. I'm expecting your replacement.
Now, like everyone else who played this game, I had some questions about this final scene. What exactly happened here? Did Alice actually spontaneously change her whole appearance? or is it just a metaphor? It could be that Alice's sudden change from her real-world self to her Wonderland self simply symbolizes the fact that she overcame her demons and no longer fears her abuser. Subsequently, when she exits the train station, she finds herself in a strange new environment that seems to be a fusion of real-world London and Wonderland. Perhaps this represents the fact that she has found peace both within her mind and with the reality of her life. However, many players choose to interpret this scene as Alice having unlocked some sort of latent psychic power that allows her to alter reality at will. After all, why else would Bumby have reacted to her with such fear after she suddenly transformed? He was so arrogant throughout the entire confrontation, completely unthreatened by her, but once her appearance changes, he backs away from her in terror. The game leaves it ambiguous, which is a decision I really like given the dreamlike, surreal quality of the source material the whole story is based on. And whether or not you like these kinds of endings, I think we can all agree that watching Alice triumph after everything she's been through and give this absolute scumbag what he deserves is an immensely satisfying ending to the game. So, are the Alice games worth playing? I'd say it depends on what you value in a video game. The first game is definitely fun, but only if you don't mind old games that feel sort of clunky compared to modern titles. As for the sequel, everything about it is beautiful aside from, well, actually playing it. That part is a little shallow. From a design perspective, they're almost total opposites. American McGee's Alice feels very much like an old game, a relic from an era where developers just wanted to give players fun things to do and weren't concerned with trying to protect them from in-game failure, while Madness Returns feels almost too much like a modern game, focused entirely on aesthetics and visual presentation while lacking in compelling gameplay or any real sense of challenge. But what both games have in common is that the story that supports them is excellent, and the worlds they give you to explore are beautiful. If you're looking for a game with deep, complex mechanics and challenging gameplay, I feel like I can safely say you won't enjoy the Alice games. But if you like to get immersed in a story and marvel at the incredible worlds that are only possible through the medium of video games, they may be worth your time. After all, these games seem to have a small but very dedicated community of players and fans even now, 10 years after the release of the most recent game, so they clearly resonated with people. And they resonated with me too in some ways. Maybe they'll do the same for you. Good luck getting your hands on them though. Neither of them are for sale on Steam anymore, and I don't know how readily available the console versions are. If you're interested in following American McGee, the creator of the games, his website is americanmcgee.com. He also has a Patreon where he details his independent work on Alice Asylum, a third game in the series that he hopes to release in the future. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.